is Matt. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Community Impact and Evaluation Specialist for the North Sound ACH. I spend a lot of my time in spreadsheets and that kind of stuff, which I think is fun. And we're going to be talking a little bit today about measuring well-being and Indigenous indicators and how we can kind of use these measurements to really kind of start, I mean, it's right there, catalyze change. And Monty's gonna come up here. Come on up, Monty, and I'll get out of your hair. And he's gonna kind of give us a grounding, and then we're gonna go into a little bit of a panel, and we'll go from there.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Matt. Good morning, everyone. I'm part of this stark transition that Liz alluded to, and hopefully it won't feel like that much of a stark transition. I mean, Remy and Jason, I mean, what a powerful storytelling. I almost feel like we could have done better by saying well-being data, because I think one of the themes we're going to hear is that there's a lot of type of data, and story is really integral to how we understand well-being. So I think you'll hear that thread, and as you hear Stacy and Jen Marie and even Matt continue to talk about this work. So here's just I'll do a quick just kind of grounding and maybe a little bit of a reminder of some of where we've been. I should start by saying I think this is my 6th year of having just the incredible honor to be writing alongside some of the work of this network, and it is amazing. Each year it seems to the content not only is great and getting better and better, but this network, the evolution of the space that is being held here and how people are able to show up as their authentic selves, to hold space for each other, to talk about things that are sometimes tough and healing, and to invoke and bring in love is really extraordinary. It's truly counter-cultural to the norm of our country, and so it's really an honor to be here and to be in this space with you, so thank you for creating that. And one of the things that I think many of you, depending on when you jumped in this river of this collaborative action network, was this North Star around how this network stands for something. It's dismantling the inherited legacies of exclusion and trauma, and to expand the vital conditions, and gonna hit a couple of those vital conditions that all of us need, kind of a nod to targeted universalism, those of you who've been around for a while, that all people who call this region home need in order to thrive. And we're gonna unpack some of that with the North Star for well-being and justice. So this measurement is anchored in this ethos and this North Star of what you all, through this collaborative action network, and to Liz's point yesterday, accent on action, and accent on catalyze what we hope measurement might be able to bring. Quinique was brilliant, I think, exercise yesterday. Some of you may remember, the Black Hat poetry. Some of these words, for those of you who are new, and certainly those of you who've been around for a while, are not new. And so these are some of the same words that you all were playing around with poetry. Creating a narrative where we've been and where we're heading, and adopting some common metrics that complement that and these commitments, and including all community members deserve to experience mental, physical, social, financial, and spiritual well-being. And there are slightly different definitions around well-being around the globe, but they mostly cover these categories. And this idea of the light, our purpose, our spirit, our identity is very much rooted in this idea of whole person and bringing our whole selves to something into our home. Inherited legacies of systemic racism that perpetuates trauma and exclusion, as we've been hearing about and reminding ourselves as a network, the legacies of trauma that date from colonialism and that the perpetuated erasure culture and white supremacy are very much alive today, as was well known, and as we're reminding ourselves. And there's other legacies that we've been talking about. And I was so taken with the story of Matika and doing her book signing in her own community with Michael Vendiola, and reminding young people, the next generation of leaders in this community, of their dignity and their rightful place as leaders and the start of new legacies. And there's no doubt there's a really interesting pathway there of legacies of healing. So this idea that together we can create new legacies is very much rooted in some of these ways of thinking about well-being and what we expect in the future. And then finally, that we can hold each other accountable to not just how we show up for this generation, but the next generation. And I think Jan-Marie had the privilege of getting to know Jan-Marie a little bit, and I think in some of the conversations as we think about indigenizing, if you will, to borrow from Matika, well-being concepts and measures is how do we really place a greater accent on what we do today with an eye to future generations. So this is how this has been landed in many ways in some of your commitments and beliefs. And while there isn't only one way of measuring well-being, we think in some ways that the kind of the state of the art, if you will, or some of the, which is in some ways going back to the future, back to the past to go to the future, is really looking at well-being from a couple different lenses. One is each of us, no matter where we're from, whatever our lineage, have our own experiences as individuals, of our perceptions, of our lived experiences, and so that helps us to better understand how we are showing up from day in and day out over the course of a life. And we're going to talk a little bit around how that there's some measures around thriving, suffering, and struggling to get at that a little bit. And then there's these 7 vital conditions that everyone needs, no matter where they are in the globe, in order to thrive. And these are place-based. These are based on where we live, where we spend most of our time in our relationships. But underlying all of this are legacies of harm and exclusion, of the resilience that our cultures have brought us here today through. So understanding that this doesn't happen in a vacuum. You know, as John Powell has reminded folks here, every group, every individual is differently situated. And so if we do not look at well-being without understanding this trajectory of the past and where we're heading in the future, the legacies that we can create, then we've really missed the point, and it just becomes another set of measures or data points that isn't really truly catalytic. So these 3 components, I think you'll hear these threads throughout, are work together, and even some of the thinking that you'll hear from the panelists. This slide is a little bit blurry, and again, there's no perfect measure of anything, but one of the measures that folks have been using around the globe that has been validated and cuts across cultures is something called Cantrell's ladder. And to give you a chance to actually just kind of test out this question, a couple of questions that really lead to, on a ladder, if you will, of 0 to 10, where would you place yourself in your best possible life, authentically? Where would you, nobody else is going to be looking at this, or being able to identify your name. And then secondly, where would you put yourself in the future, 5 years from now? And that indicator that's been used since the 60s is highly predictive of how people think, feel, function, and what they will do. And so I don't want to overstate to pigeonhole people with one indicator, but if we were going to use some measures like this, this is one that really allows us to start to think about who's suffering, struggling, and thriving individually and as we break this down by groups. There's a lot of noise on this. I remember a really great partner learning session around data justice and just, you know, how data has been used to oppress in extractive ways. Do you remember the data justice partner learning session that a number of folks, some of you may have participated in that? And I think what we're continuing to learn is that data, if we do not break it down by certain demographics, including race and ethnicity, gender identity, other factors, it can mask gross inequities and different lived experiences. And so one of the things that those of you who have expressed a lot of interest in data is, how do we break this down to tell our collective story and our different stories of people who share a common home? So that's one of the opportunities I think coming up. And just as a reminder, some of you have seen this in fact on the resource library that Meg and others have been helping to curate. There's a lot of more information about the vital conditions, about the art and science of measuring well-being and things of this nature. Some of you may know that when some of us started to curate how might our country respond with greater resiliency, with greater humanity, not to the status quo of inequities, one of the first communities we reached out to was North Sound, and Liz and Daryl and others that helped us to shape what it would look like to respond as a country in communities with greater resilience. And so we use this vital conditions framework that is this interrelated, more holistic way of thinking about our places. Thriving natural environment, it's access to healthy soils and water. We heard about the rape and plunder of our earth that Matika was talking about yesterday. How do we make sure that we have freedom from other climate-induced disasters that we can mitigate? Basic needs, it includes food and food security and access to mental health and behavioral health services, among other things. Humane housing. So what does it look like? Not just kind of abstract ideas, but very specifically, what type of housing do we need in order to thrive? Safe, affordable, reliable housing that so many of you are working on here. Same with meaningful work and wealth, not just looking at income, but really looking at the racial wealth gaps that we experience in this country and the history of why that is, but also looking at people's sense of purpose and what they connect to. So that's one of the vital conditions. Lifelong learning, the first 1,000 days of life, the K through 12, meaningful education. I love Remy's example of cobbling together. What does it look like to be a lifelong learner? Take advantage and really think about what it looks like to have learning continue to nourish us. Reliable transportation. And then finally, and I will just double click on this, at the center of this, which I think makes this, at least in the global American culture, a little bit countercultural, is that it puts belonging and civic muscle at the center of it. Our well-being, our sense of belonging, being able to belong to a intergenerational, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural place is an extraordinary and unusual thing in the United States right now and many other places. Our sense of belonging, and I mentioned John Powell before, he's had a real influence here, and I think on many of us too, that this belonging is the art of co-creation. So being able to belong is the ability to co-create with others, and that's what animates all these other things. So all these groups around creating humane housing and sovereign food systems and equitable food systems has everything to do with our sense of belonging and our civic muscle, our capacity to act together. So this is center to this piece with the underlying premise that we will only thrive if we thrive together, which is kind of the whole pathway here. And so this offers some measurement strategies, and this is just almost a visual prompt that underneath each one of these vital conditions are very specific indicators that a growing body of evidence and practical experience with community-based groups are using to drive their work forward. So if we could unpack humane housing and belonging and civic muscle, there's a number of indicators underneath each of these. And just my brief conversation with Jan Marie, who you'll hear is also the board chair of the Washington Public Health Association was recently, is how these in some ways align or complementary of some of the Indigenous indicator work that she's going to share with you. That's been amazing work that's been happening over more than a decade, and how we might really better understand how we can infuse Indigenous values, which in some ways I think many of these are complementary, and indicators potentially. So I'll just kind of sum it up, and then I think Michaela is going to come up here in just a minute just to give a cue. So much of measurement in the past has been this kind of area of experts, that these narrow, evaluative, backwards looking, and not to say that evaluation is a bad thing. Evaluation, it can be a good thing, but a lot of our data has been really looking backwards, and it's centering on more narrow concepts, which is why I think frameworks like the vital conditions, where more people can see themselves, are more holistic frameworks about people in place, where we've preferenced so much I should have put quantitative data, so my bad. We've preferenced in our others the quantitative data over qualitative data. Our stories, the depth, the weight of the story that Remy just put out there, and the stories that we heard, from Matika are powerful. So we need to figure out how we blend both the unharmonized qualitative and quantitative data. We know that frameworks that have been inherited in this country reflect, a white dominant culture that in many ways reflect kind of subtle white supremacy or maybe even explicit and other forms of kind of dominant culture values at the expense of a lot of our other values, including, the unique values that kind of, are embedded here. So how do we make sure that we have frameworks and indicators and storytelling that really reflects a lot of different cultural experiences? And last is this idea that data is exclusive, that other people own it. People can use it for however they want to use it. And it's been used and abused in extractive ways, not always, or just used, collected, and not used, right? How many of you have been a part of something that's collected and wonder, what the heck was that used for? And this is really, how do we make this more transparent? How do we engage in shared meaning making around that and processes? So this is hopefully just a little bit of a reminder that some of you have been on this measurement in a catalytic way journey. And so I think, Michaela, were we going to bring up chairs for the group? Yes. So Michaela, to the stage again, and thank you so much.